Hola, muy buenas tardes, ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to Casa Árabe and our first talk of 2021. A year that as much hope that there is to see change from the previous year, the extremely tough 2020, seems to be somehow a continuity of very unstable moments. We've just seen that mob very recently breaking into the capital, or here in Madrid, the massive snowfall that we've had and that has paralyzed somehow our activity. I am broadcasting from home as opposed to from Casa Árabe. And well, this seems to be literally just the tip of the iceberg. But today we're here to speak about a conflict that has long occupied a small space in the international scene, in the international media. Of course, we know about the start of the revolution in Sanaa in 2011 as part of that wave of revolts and uprisings that we call the Arab Spring. This today's virtual roundtable actually is the first of our cycle called The People Want, Al-Sha'b Yurid, aimed at explaining what took place 10 years ago in the Arab countries. But we have teamed up today with the Center for Strategic Studies in Sanaa to try and understand how that revolution turned into a regional war in 2015 and where we are today in 2021. The war in Yemen, which escalated in March 2015 when a Saudi-led coalition intervened on behalf of the internationally recognized government against Houthi rebels aligned with former President Ali Abdullah Saleh. But as with the US-led invasion of Iraq, a surgical war does not turn out to be one. For what was already a poor country has become a humanitarian catastrophe. Hunger and fighting have provoked mass famine and waves of refugees. The images that we'll see have now become staple when speaking about the dire situation of Yemen. Some of these images are indeed disturbing. So Yemenis as a people are already facing what the UN has classified as one of the world's, or as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Everything indicates that their suffering will only increase as more local communities are forced to take sides. Given the ongoing lack of agreement and with the forces of the so-called Arab coalition, that is Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, this force is greatly reduced. Local players are now positioning themselves for war on behalf of their external sponsors, proxy wars that we call, but played by local protagonists. After 6 years of armed conflict, the country has split at least 3 ways, or in 3 parts. The Houthis in the north fighting the Abu Dhabi-backed secessionists, and the weak government of Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi in the east with support from Riyadh. The influx of money and weapons from regional actors will lead to further polarization. That is not something unheard of. And by turning the conflict into a full-fledged proxy war, the states that once formed that Arab coalition will be able very likely to shirk their responsibility in providing reparations and assistance to rebuild the country. But I'm not the expert on Yemen. Let me introduce our panelists today. Farea Al-Muslimi is the director and co-founder of the Center for Strategic Studies in Sanaa. He's also an associate member of Chatham House. Prior to that, he worked for the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. as a visiting scholar, where he covered Yemen and the Gulf. His CV is also wider. You can access it on our website. Welcome, Farah. He's joining us from Cairo. We have also Ghaithaa Alrashidy. She's a researcher and a visual data specialist with the Sanaa Center for Strategic Studies, with whom we are partnering today to bring you this roundtable. Her research focuses on southern Yemen and also on security and social issues in the southern governorates. She's also a co-presenter on Dunyana, a weekly TV show on BBC Arabic that deals with issues pertinent to women in the Arab world. Ghaithaa was on her way back to Yemen, but she is currently connected from Sudan. And last but not least, Natalia Sancha. She's an independent journalist and photographer who specializes in the Arab world. She has been living in Lebanon since 2008. Since 2011, she has covered the wave of popular protests in the Middle East and also conflicts in countries such as Egypt, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria. She also contributes to the Spanish daily newspaper El País for Lebanon, from Lebanon and Syria, and publishes analysis on regional politics in Es Global and Política Exterior. So Natalia, who was the main culprit behind having us celebrate or organize this roundtable as our first action in 2021, unfortunately cannot join us. She was meant to do so, but due to the extreme weather conditions, she was stranded in Madrid and now is finally flying back to Beirut. She did manage to send us a short video on her recent visit to Yemen, a few minutes before boarding her flight to Lebanon. We will see that in a few seconds. But before that, I would like to ask Farah and Ghaithaa about that spark that lit the fire, that is the so-called Arab Spring. If we could go back to 2011 and talk about that flame that ignited the so-called coffee revolution, also known as the Yemeni revolution of dignity. I know you are young. You were definitely much younger at the time, but I'm sure you can still remember what it felt like, what were the hopes of that young generation demonstrating in the streets. So tell us about that Yemeni spring. I'll start with you, Farah.
Thank you very much. I think what we think of Arab Spring today depends on which side you take of events. You would say this was the biggest regret or the greatest thing that happened in your life. I think to be in full disclosure, I will say that, you know, if time goes back, I will do it again, meaning I will be part of, or I will try to be part of what happened in that year. I think, yes, the country, like many other countries in the region, has fallen into a combination of a proxy war, civil wars, and obviously we have missed our ability and opportunity to move forward as a society. However, the way we understand power and the way power used to emerge in Yemen before 2011 is gone. And obviously we are today witnessing a huge different projection or destructive projection of power from regional countries, from armed groups, from former regimes. But more or less, whether it takes years or decades, the country has started a path that was basically closed before that, which is the ability to be able to imagine a solution for the grievances Yemenis have gone through, and also to imagine a different Yemen. I think 10 years later, there is tons of mistakes we can look back at, and we can reflect, and we can think and imagine. But absolutely, what that year did is it redefined power for how we understood it as a society, whether you look into Yemen or Egypt or Algeria. And I think for the Yemenis, this was, and I think the Egyptians and Syrians, for an entire generation, this was the year when their biographies changed totally and forever, and their life stories changed. So that's obviously a reference point. It's basically a huge milestone in this generation. And it's basically something, if you look to the situations in Sudan or Algeria the last few years, can tell you, actually, no matter what happened, yes, regimes and foreign powers and monarchies have tried to make people definitely regret revolting and definitely to feel guilty. But what happened, if you see, is in Sudan and Algeria. This was a very good example where people were not bullied, actually. And still, what some even called the second wave of Arab Spring is an example, in my opinion, of what was sparked in 2011, despite the huge cost, despite the huge price, and despite the unity of all anti-Arab Spring to make people regret it or even to feel sorry about it. I think Sudan and Algeria give us a very good reminder about what that year means for the current generation, but also for the region in the next decades to go. Over. Thank you.
Thank you, Farea. How about Ghaithaa? I mean, that Arab Spring in Yemen also made women, Yemeni women, quite visible to the world. How is your evaluation of that moment for recent Yemeni history, Ghaithaa?
First, thank you for you to remember us this moment and this events that change our life and change our future. It's complex feelings. We feel like we was naive, we was dreamer. We think that we can change the country and make our dreams become something true. But unfortunately, that's not happened. However, we learn a lot from this revolution. We understanding the situation in Yemen more and more. We stand to other. We feel like how much all these forces, regime and region, countries, and all these elements that change our revolution to war. However, how much it's big and it's strong, we still feel like we can do more. We can explain ourselves more than before. We can change even small pieces of our society and our country, even if all these things not in the same what we was dream.
Thank you both for this just first feel of the moment that we will explain later how it became what we have today. But yes, as Farea said, a big milestone of also understanding power structures and how there was a sense of agency on behalf of the populations that they could change somehow their history, even if somewhat naive and dreamlike, as Ghaithaa put it. So we'll go back to you in a few minutes. Just let's hear it from Natalia, who managed to send us this video minutes before boarding her flight in Madrid's Adolfo Suarez airport.
Actors were actually confronted in Yemen. I will just try to talk a little bit about my last coverage of the country. As you all know, very few journalists are able to enter. There's a very strict embargo by land, sea, and air imposed by Saudi Arabia and Emirates, and it's very difficult to cover. I have to say, not for the sake of propaganda, but because I think it's important to recognize the role. País is the only newspaper, Spanish newspaper, who has covered this conflict in 2 occasions, in 2015 from the Houthi area, and now from the, let's say, pro-Saudi or Saudi allies in Shabwa. For the sake of transparency, I will describe how was the trip organized. It was organized by Sanaa Center. We're a group of 11 journalists from different media, Le Monde, The Guardian, The Times, and some other. We were the only Spanish newspaper. And we were under the protection of the governor of Shabwa, which is Mr. Ben Ali. And we were escorted by their armies and some of the personal security men. Shabwa is very interesting because probably Farea will talk about it, but it's a province which is in the middle of the country and have a border in the north with the Houthis and a border in the south with the region which is disputed between secessionists like those militias supported by the Emiratis and those who are loyal to President Hadi, which is recognized by the international community and currently living in Riyadh. So these internal dynamics will be them to talk about it. For my part, I would like to talk what is, I think, is the most important, which is the humanitarian situation and the civilians. The current war in Yemen, it's probably the most disastrous one that is living in the Middle East, where there is full war. You have the Libyan, the Syrian, and the Iraqis, but only in Yemen you have 80% of the population, which is 24 millions out of 30 millions of Yemenis who are depending of the humanitarian aid. As the UN put it, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. How do we see this on the ground? On the ground, maybe the most shocking part of it is to have thousands, over 100,000 kids, minors of 5 years old, who are fighting between death and life because of malnutrition. Malnutrition given not only to the situation of what's, the poor situation of the economy, the devaluation of the Yemeni real, and the huge strict embargo over the country, which affects also the income of goods, medication, and food. On the part of the human rights, we also have to talk about the deterioration of the human rights. We are talking in all the actors. Let's see, in the north with the Houthis, or in the south, Emiratis or Saudis, are multiplying the secret prisons where young men, or not that young, are disappeared by force, killed, tortured, which adds to a population which is exhausted after 5 years of war, exhausted because they cannot bring every day in search of food and water to bring to their families, and now some of them are in the search, in the painful search of those who have disappeared on the hands of Emiratis or pro-Emiratis militias, Saudis or pro-Saudis militias, or Houthis. So this is an added problem, and we don't have to forget that those countries are allies of the European Union, and maybe something should be done to pressure for these things to be clarified. As I say, not many journalists are entering in Yemen, which means that there is not too many witnesses. Likewise, not many Yemenis are leaving, unlike it happened in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya, that there is a huge drainage or routes for refugees to leave the country. This doesn't happen in Yemen. As a transversal topics in the current situation in Yemen, I would like to mention, as I do usually in my coverage, the situation of the woman. The space, the public space of the woman is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Is tribal societies, a conservative society, and like any other world, normally the space of women to be protected, they are more reduced in the inside of the houses and not in the outside, which means they are not present on the markets, on the commerce, they don't work, they don't participate to politics, not to any of the decisions. So basically, as usual, there is a very small number of armed men decided for the fate of the whole population. Regarding the pandemic, which is the first cause of worry for many countries nowadays, in Yemen it looks like it's not really the big problem for them, or this is what the doctors were saying. We don't know yet if this is given of the hermetism or how it's closed, the insulation of the country, or as the United Nations says, the lack of tests and the lack of PCRs done on the population because of the lack of means to know which is the real situation of the COVID-19 over there. Anyhow, when we go to the hospitals, which of course they are lacking all kinds of medications and materials, the doctors, the first preoccupation they have, the first worry they share is not the COVID. Actually, there is more people dying from dengue and from malnutrition than people dying from COVID or from the war. To give you an idea, there is over 2,000 cases of COVID in Yemen, 600 deaths, but there is more than 52,000 cases of dengue. So it's very normal to see like young kids struggling with very high fevers, respiratory problems given to dengue, and malnutrition. Another important thing we saw on the ground in Yemen is the amount of illegal migrants. Yemen is a transit country for more than 140,000 last year of migrants coming from Somalia and Ethiopia, and now they're all stranded because the pandemic has closed even the illegal routes to Saudi Arabia, where they are trying to reach in order to seek for a better life and work there. So we can see how the illegal market and the illegal mafias can be controlled when there is a necessity, and this is what is happening on the other side. Over 15,000 of migrants, the vast majority Ethiopians, are stranded in the country without no resources, without no job, without some of them lacking food and water. So this is making the situation more complicated because Yemenis, which are well known for their hospitality, now they cannot help them out because they don't have enough for themselves and their families. The data of the war: 110,000 deaths, 3.6 million of displaced. This adds more to the situation of this country. For my part, I wanted to say that it shouldn't be the case that in the 21st century we have a country of the Middle East that kids are dying because of hunger. It's not, the country is fully besieged. It's not something that should be happening. So thank you very much for Casa Árabe to talk about Yemen. Thank you for the Yemenis to talk about Yemen, because it's very difficult that this happen and that we can talk outside. Yemeni population had shown the great hospitality to those who come from abroad and the interest for those who come from abroad to be there, but the embargo does not allow it. So we should be talking more about Yemen. Our governments should be pressuring more about Yemen too. I hope you enjoyed the debate. Again, I apologize for not be there. Weather made it not possible, and I hope I will be able to catch my flight to Beirut now. Good afternoon to everyone.
That was Natalia Sancha sending us her video from Madrid's Barajas airport. Thank you very much. And she raised a few important points that will very likely come back in the debate or even in the interventions of both Ghaithaa and Farea. She mentioned the role of women and their as she said, the space that is constantly in public space that has been reduced over the years for women's action and participation. She mentioned also the COVID pandemic, and that it is not the main worry for hospitals, which are dealing with both malnutrition and dengue. And she also mentioned something that we don't hear much about, that is the migrants trapped in Yemen, Ethiopian and Somalis on their way to Saudi. So we'll very likely come back to those. Feel free, Ghaithaa and Farea, if you want to include that in your analysis. Otherwise, during the Q&A, we will very likely pose those questions. We have also a very recent piece of news that the U.S. government, last few moments of Donald Trump's government, that seemed to be not a single moment goes by without Mr. Trump giving us another surprise. So he designated the Houthi as a terrorist organization. A move that will make it extremely difficult, that will have a very, very important impact on the distribution of humanitarian aid. So I'll first start with you, Ghaithaa. You have prepared a talk with being yourself a visual data specialist. We have a number of maps that will help us understand better what's going on in Yemen at the moment. So the floor is yours, Ghaithaa Alrashidy.
Thank you. I will start with this video. This video shows the arms clashes and conflict in different areas in Yemen. It's the ground fights during since 2015 till 2000 mid of 2020. When you see this, you can see that there is almost all the areas of in Yemen suffering from this conflict. All the Yemenis are a bit too much for this war, and this maps are showing the conflict in the ground between cities and villages and in the street and near the schools and the hospitals and the houses. I cannot include also the airstrikes and landmine and missiles, because it's a huge data that will need more time and more informations. We can see during all these years how the conflict changed from area to area to other areas, how in the last 2 years are focusing in the boundaries of Houthis areas, like in the Marib and Hudaydah and Taiz and Al-Dala. And last one of these maps, okay, can you stop it, please? Yeah. The second map, it will show the population density in Yemen and the conflict areas. This is in the red frame. This is the areas that have most conflicts during the 5 years. And the colors of the map showing how much people in each area, how much people suffering from this conflict, how much people moving from their areas to other areas to avoid the war. And if you see, you will see that the most population are in the areas of the Houthis. And the other areas around Yemen that under control the government have less density of population in Yemen. Next, please. This is one of our suffering in Yemen. We cannot move, we cannot travel, we cannot reach any areas like before. For example, here I show you the roads, main roads between the governorates before and after the war. For example, from Aden to Sanaa, people was traveling in 8.5 hours, and now it takes 13 hours and more. It's depend about the conflict areas and the checkpoints. People who want to travel from Sanaa to Marib, before the war, they was traveling during 2.5 hours. Now they need 9 hours to reach Marib. And one of the problems in this specific road, that all the northern areas, all the people in the northern areas, when they want to travel outside the Yemen, they need to go to Sayoun because it's difficult for them to went to Aden. So they travel more than 20 hours to can reach the airport, and that's effect about for people who suffering from some disease or people need special medical care. And it's not including it's not only inside Yemen, even outside Yemen, it's difficult to people to move. For example, I'm stuck here in Sudan because in the last minute they canceled the flight from Sudan to Aden. So I will stay for 5 days to can reach my family in Aden. Next, please. In this map, we see the zone of conflict and control. We can see the areas that under control the Houthis and how all the conflict areas is around it. We can see the other part of the conflict parties, the government, how many parties inside it. We can see the government in the yellow, the government forces controlling the areas in the yellow color, and in orange we have Hadrami elite forces that's supported by Emiratis. In Aden and Lahj with the purple color, we can see the STC forces that controlling those areas, also supported by the Emiratis. And the last one are in the west coast, Tariq Saleh forces, also supported by the Emiratis. Next, please. Next map. Yeah. This is our resources, oil and national gas. This is our small resources and biggest crisis. All want this. All of them want the oil and the gas and controlling those areas. And if you comparing between what we have from oil and gas with the Gulf countries, it's nothing. All of them want to controlling this area because of this small resources. We can see, for example, how the conflict areas in Marib almost reaching the national gas station in Marib, and that will be a disaster for the Yemenis. We can see in the right of the map, the line, the sketch of the pipeline, the oil pipeline that Saudi Arabia want to do it in Yemen, and how now she controlling Al Mahra with more than 17 military camp in Al Mahra. And the Al Mahra government, it's the only area that the Houthis cannot reach it, and she was avoided all the wars during the last years. Next, please. Here we can see our relationship between us and the region countries, how each one of them have a piece of the cake, how each one of them trying to control some of the areas, some of the influence, some of the people in Yemen. We can see the areas under control, the Houthis with the orange color that following Iran. We can see, for example, Al Mahra in the pink color. Al Mahra had a historical relationship between them and Oman. They are have a lot of society economists, and a lot of relationships make them with Oman are stronger than any other area, even stronger than their relationship with Yemen. And we see Saudi Arabia how trying to control Al Mahra because of the line pipe of oil. We can see Hadramaut, how it's separate between the forces following by Emiratis, the Hadrami elite forces, and also Ali Mohsen forces that supported Islah, supported by Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and so on for the other all the governorates in Yemen. Next, please. In this map, if we remember the first video, we will see that the conflict changed during all the years from areas to other areas. It's a normal thing in our war in Yemen, but there is a key centers in the Yemen conflict. We have, for example, Saada. The war in Saada is begin before 2015 because they have this relationship, not relationship, incorrect, ولكن, but they are near Saudi Arabia more than Sana'a. they are a problem for Saudis more than they was a problem for the Yemenis, because the link between them and all the Shi'is citizens in Saudi Arabia, in Najran and Sharqiya, that in the same borders between them and Sanaa. We can also see Al-Mahra again, and the relationship Oman, and how Saudi trying to controlling Al-Mahra, and also the Emiratis in the beginning start with trying to control it, but the relationship with the Mahranian people more with Omanis than Yemenis or other countries. The third key center is Marib to Aden. In Marib, the government exists only in Marib. Islah and government in general. So to can make government being in Aden, they need to control all these four governorates, Shabwa and Abyan, to Aden, because the forces cannot move from Marib to Aden unless they pass from Shabwa and Abyan. And that's what happened, and the conflict in 2019, in August 2019, when the STC controlling Aden and moved to Abyan and trying to reach Shabwa, but he cannot take Shabwa, and he comes to Abyan. And now it's supposed to be all this conflict in these four areas with the Riyadh agreement have solved, but we are waiting for what will going on. And the fourth area is Al-Hudaydah, or the West Coast. It's the new or the future disaster that will happen, because it's controlling the Bab al-Mandab, it's controlling the Red Sea, and it's controlling more than 70% of Yemeni people in the Houthis areas that they living by the aid coming from Al-Hudaydah. Next one, please. In this map, we see the Saudis' military camps, and also the formal UAE military camps that taken by Saudis now or by local forces. And if we comparing between this map and the map before, we will find that the Saudis and Emiratis, they will not close to the conflict areas. They are not close to the Houthis front lines, except in Marib and Nehem. They're just focusing on the ports, seaports, and the border between Saudi and Yemen, and for pipeline oil. Next, please. This map showing the military camps in Aden before 2019, the conflict that happened in 2019. And for now, almost all these camps are controlled the STC forces or the UAE local forces. The new challenge for government, because they cannot handle all this number of forces and leaders, and it always, since the Houthis leave Aden only, and the biggest problem in Aden is the security forces. It's not in the formal army or the government army. They have a lot of powerful, a lot of guns, a lot of by them, and also they have personal interest that will not let them accept changes that happen after the. So it's difficult for it's difficult for the leaders that now controlling all Aden to just give these forces back to the government.
Okay, I think we're having some trouble with Ghaithaa's connection. Right. So I'm not sure how many of the maps were still remaining for Ghaithaa to explain. We might be able to come back to her when the connection is established. But let us go with Farea, who's in Cairo with a fantastic connection so far. Since we were, let's say, the last image we had there was about Aden, let us start with that very extremely concerning attack that we had, if I'm not mistaken, on December 31st on Aden's airport. Also, a very specific attack or directed towards a new is it government or cabinet? Tell us a bit more. Give us some context, Farea, about what took place and how that happened.
Clearly, thanks God first, that didn't end up being as destructive as it could have been. The government, the entire neo cabinet was there. That could have, I think, pushed Yemen away from peace for even decades further than what actually it did. It's still a huge blow, obviously. It's a problem internally, security for the government. It's an intelligence problem, but it's also a problem that pushes the peace process much further, the Houthis and their enemies in the other side of the government. This was a newly formed government. Everyone was it represented almost everyone except the Houthis. Everyone was waiting for it since over a year and a half. It was supposed to be the side that probably will negotiate with the Houthis. So definitely the attack is huge and destructive in every way, as you can see, but it is also a great news that it did not happen ultimately. It did not, or it wasn't as destructive as it could have been initially planning in that regards.
Tell us about, or tell us a bit more about that newly formed cabinet, Farea. You said if a disaster would have struck that group of people, who would have taken us back so many years or behind what we already are. So give us an idea of how or what does that cabinet symbolizes? What do they represent?
It's a new arrangement, obviously, between the proxies of Saudis and the proxies of UAE more than any other side. But let me probably zoom a bit back into some, I guess, 3 ideas overall that I think are important and will change the next phase of the crisis in Yemen. Number 1 is, I think, as Ghaithaa and Natalia were almost saying, that Yemen war is, partially a civil war, clearly, since 2014 and the Houthis take over. It's also partially a proxy war between different sides, Iran, Saudi, but also UAE, Saudi sometimes, Qatar, UAE at different times. And it's also, the third element of it is a failed state, failed structure, failed transition that's happening within. This newly formed government was supposed to be theoretically one that unifies these proxies, one that tries to function from Aden, and one that was headed by a relatively new and relatively clean guy. And he was supposed to have the support of the coalition and the support of the international community. Obviously, that attack was a huge blow security-wise. And obviously, it speeded what you were asking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist group by the United States of America, specifically a few days before Trump leaves office. While the Houthis definitely and arguably fit to be a terrorist organization, if you put all indicators together, they compete with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in many ways, in starving population, in obviously torturing and imprisoning journalists, in attacking civilians, and all of that horrible list that can go. However, this process, despite whether the Houthis merit it or no, is a different conversation. But whether it will make things faster or easier or harder, I think it definitely will make much more complication in Yemen. As Natalia and Ghaithaa were saying, you already have a huge movement of mobility of people, mobility of goods, mobility of food, mobility of medicine in and into the country. And definitely you have had a lot of issues of financial transactions, especially, again, the last 5 years. This definitely will make it much worse in that sense. It will impact the humanitarian crisis. It will impact the way that people do business between Yemen and the world. And it obviously further, I think, increases that suffering in that level. Now, Yemen, and I can stop there and we go if anyone has any questions, since I know we are running out of time. I think Yemen, yes, the United Nations correctly says that Yemen is the worst crisis in humanitarian crisis in the world. But that's not a crisis that came out of an earthquake or a flood or a natural disaster. This is a man-made crisis in which Western countries are highly complicit in, including Spain, by supporting selling of weapons, by engaging with whether with Iran or with the Saudis unconditionally in matter of their support to Yemen. But obviously, this is a problem where even before COVID, Yemen was on a lockdown, and this international siege, is a siege by UN Security Council resolutions, by regional actors, by local militias, but most importantly, with a huge international and, in my opinion, Western complexity into this war or into this crisis that's basically happening today in Yemen. Over.
Farea, let me ask you, since you started your explanation of this cabinet, the newly formed cabinet, by saying it's basically a new agreement of between the Saudis and the UAE. There is clearly such a deep involvement now of Gulf countries in the destiny of your country. So one very recent change in the Gulf has been the reconciliation between these countries and Qatar, that were at odds for a good, was it 3 years now? So how does this affect, because we saw Ghaitha's map, there was also a very, with the colors of the fingers of the neighbors in Yemen. And all of them, will probably leave Oman out of it for the moment, but we definitely have a Qatari finger, very clearly Saudi, and very clearly Emirati. How does the reconciliation between these countries affect Yemen?
Let me probably say three things about that aspect of Yemen and the neighboring countries overall. As you said, unfortunately, they always have had the say on the future of Yemen, whether politically or economically or in many other ways. What happened, and hence this obviously, whether a reconciliation or escalation in the Gulf, will immediately impact Yemen, especially in an era of proxy wars. Proxy wars right now, you have rich countries with less accountabilities or close to zero accountability internally, are fighting each other via local forces in different parts of the region, whether that's Yemen or Syria or Libya. But Yemen is a very good example from an international theory point of view, since it demonstrates how a destructive proxy war is actually much more destructive than a direct war in some ways, because it also ends up further fragmentation. For example, in Yemen, more really the last year had Qatar against Saudi and UAE as in the past, or it was becoming, and this is a place where we went to see in Shabwa, for example, where Natalia was with us. You notice that this very small, minor, governorate in Yemen today is at the heart of a proxy war. And that proxy war is not between Qatar and Saudi, it's actually between UAE and the Saudi. And these were, in fact, theoretically alliance 5 years ago. So in some ways, that was the current formation of the coalition itself is already changing. So despite their reconciliation in Yemen. The second aspect I would say is Qatar was not militarily involved in Yemen heavily. It didn't go and took troops or even airstrikes to help the Saudis. But what Qatar did in Yemen for the Saudis when they were on the same page is it blocked the international coverage of Yemen, or it helped to block it. It basically gave the Saudis a pass from whatever they wanted to do in Yemen, because obviously Qatar has a huge media empire. I think that is unfortunately will like to change more the next few months and years, because we are complaining there isn't enough coverage on Yemen. I think it will only be much less now with Qatar basically trying to make out with the Saudis. That's definitely going to have an impact. Overall, the development in the Gulf, I think, is a very good news for everyone. These are rich countries with no rule of law when it comes to their foreign interventions. So the less they have problems with each other, the happier days it is for their poorer and weaker regions, neighbors, whether that's Yemen or other countries on the Horn of Africa. Over.
Thank you, Farea. We'll start asking for questions from our audience at this stage. I don't know if we've managed to reestablish contact with Ghaithaa. We'll keep trying. And we apologize for the connection. We were actually quite lucky to have Ghaithaa live from Khartoum. She had already warned us that she had a very unstable connection. So it was actually the last slide where we had issues. We apologize also to our translators who were unable to translate what Ghaithaa was saying due to the interference. So I wanted to ask you about Iran. So, I mean, there seems to be a clear message from Trump's designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization against Iran, and maybe linked to my previous question with the reconciliation of the Gulf countries, of the GCC countries. How does Iran stand now in this correlation of antagonistic forces in Yemen?
If definitely from the recent Gulf reconciliation, I think if there is a loser, it's definitely Tehran and probably a few other folks in addition to the PR companies and lobbies in Washington, D.C. and Western companies, because the Gulf countries are no more in a war with each other in D.C. and other Western countries. But Iran definitely loses from that. It definitely benefited from the Gulf fracture. It definitely benefited from everyone sidelining Qatar. And it definitely created a semi-parallel interest in Yemen with Qatar when Qatar was not in good terms with Saudis. That includes some support for different groups around the country, but that also includes a huge support for the Houthis in matter of their media and international presence. Qatar, funnily enough, Iran, funnily enough, was not as powerful in Yemen at the beginning of the war, in fact, as it now has much more leverage over the Houthis. The only ambassador in Sana'a right now is the Iranian ambassador. Somehow he managed to get there. And the only country that's externally talking to the Houthis is actually, or more diplomatically and engaged, is actually Iran. So somehow this war has strengthened this relationship between the Houthis and Tehran the last 5 years. And definitely, if there is a new conversation now with Biden in power about a new Iran deal, a new regional order, possibly that Iran can play a constructive role in Yemen. But so far it had no incentive. It's spending very little in Yemen and making a lot of noise and mess for Saudi Arabia. So it was a very, very small investment for it, but ultimately it led it into a huge Santa Claus, I would say, a Christmas gift, that it wasn't really, because when you think of Yemen, for Iran, it's not Syria, it's not Iraq, it wasn't Lebanon. It didn't spend decades and billions of dollars actually on that and nothing. It really didn't. But since the beginning of the war, it still didn't invest much. It definitely, we know that they sent weapons here and there. We know they sent some money here and there. We know they sent some fuel here and there. But it's nothing compared, for example, to the Saudi spending in Yemen. And it's most certainly for it a huge added value, as it can annoy Saudi very closely from its southern borders. Yemen for Saudi Arabia is a domestic national issue. It's not a foreign policy issue. It's not even the file of Yemen in Saudi Arabia is not in the hands of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's in the hand of the Ministry of Interior. In fact, that the decision making on Yemen. So it's definitely a huge blow. And Iran is investing very little, or at least in the past, and it has definitely the war has definitely pushed the Houthis actually, and the essentiality of this relationship with Tehran much more than it used to be in the past. Over.
Thank you, Farah. We have a question from Susana Maceira. She wants to know why all this fight or this struggle for the wealth of Yemen and not accepting the help, the mutual help between different countries. So it might sound a bit idealistic, but I think there is a question behind it about also the I guess the strategic importance of Yemen, as you mentioned, a very key neighbor for Saudi Arabia. But Susanna's asking why not just cooperate and join forces between all these neighbors instead of fighting for Yemen.
Yes, or I ask the same question, or why not, at least a clean Brexit in that case. But look, I think there is something when it comes to Yemen and the surrounding region that has been quite frightening for our surrounding region since thousands of years. And today we started this conversation by a conversation about Arab Spring 10 years ago, which is, something happened. Yemen is a very dynamic country. It has a political experience. It has a republic. It moves. It's a threatening in that level. It was a threatening to Oman in the 60s and 70s. It was threatening to Saudis at that end. It's a republic and very moving place in one of the most stable regions of the world. So that's definitely something I would imagine that's making the Gulf less comfortable of just having an okay relationship in Yemen. But there is another issue, I think, is Yemen is blogged with many things, but one of its worst things probably, or of the pains it has, is its elite, the political elite, really. The political parties, those who are in power, whether on all sides, they did sell Yemen cheap. Iran invests nothing in Yemen compared to what it invests on Hezbollah, but the Houthis sells it very cheap. UAE spends nothing on STC compared to spend on Haftar in Libya, but they sell it very cheap. You do have a very political class and power that has taken the destiny of the country for decades, since times of Saleh actually, to sell it to a foreigner supplier. Whoever that supplier is it the Soviet Union, is it Saudi Arabia, is it Iran, or is it sometimes counter-terrorism operations or even oil companies? That is, as Yemenis, I think that is our big part of this, is there is always someone who wants to sell for a very low price, and that's quite a problem for a nation to face, and especially when it's a very poor nation and it has a weak government and weak state. The state is not as strong like here in Egypt, or in institutions or agencies to kind of maintain the state sovereignty. That still haven't, the bones of the state in Yemen are still very fragile and very weak. So you have low, very low prices elites, and you have neighbors freaking out about what will come from this very dynamic Southerners. All of these, I think, have inspired foreigner players in Yemen to be much more destructive than they could have been in the past, whether the close neighbors or far friends and neighbors.
Mm-hmm. Interesting point that you've raised, the political elites and how they have sold Yemen cheaply. Maybe there is a self-esteem type of issue amongst the elites, or maybe because it's a poor country, they don't see the possibility of, let's say, charging more for allowing this foreign penetration. There is a line of, let's say, of research or analysis that sort of like explores the psychology behind the actual decision makers, or if they indeed see themselves as proper players in the region, or if they see themselves as somehow in a inferiority complex type of position.
And I think that applies the way you go even in the region. You find the same Gulf countries, I think, who have the same feeling toward the United States of America. You would see it even in a Trump humiliating all Gulf countries, and they would pay for it. It's almost like a different layers of self-humiliation. And I think that's part of it is obviously self-esteem, but part of it is, as you said, how people understand international relations, how they understand power, and most importantly, how they came into power and what might take them in power or out of power. And that was the big eruption of 2011, is you can no more really have all of these securances around you. And I think that's a similar context we are facing today, where, again, as you said, elites and powers and decision makers report to anyone except the people, anyone except those in the ground. And that's obviously the way how they came and the way they made it to power also influence a lot of this set of minds.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question from Clara Rodriguez Migueles. She wants to know how do you think the role of the United Arab Emirates has conditioned the position of other international actors and the balance of power between local forces? She adds, I think this has changed a lot since the beginning of the war, but please, can you elaborate?
Clearly, UAE tool at the moment or strategy in Yemen seems to be moving out and supporting local actors, whether STC in the south or elite in the Hadrami elite in Hadramaut, or the Tariq Saleh forces in the Red Sea. These are the three main proxies it has right now in Yemen. And it's pulling back, but also empowering them more in money, in weapon, and obviously in political support. That seems to be its strategy. What this has done, obviously, over the last few years is you created more and more proxies in the country. Obviously, in another word, more armed men with a payroll. And that obviously is a huge power that's somehow on a hyper nation, somehow sleeping. No one have used it as much as you can imagine, actually. That is something, it definitely, you cannot imagine the STC without UAE support. You definitely cannot imagine Tariq Saleh forces without UAE support. That's definitely fundamental to their existing today, and obviously to the power, to the balance of power they have. I think what's also obvious within UAE position in Yemen is it has two other main agenda. One, obviously, to fight the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's for them a priority more than even the Houthis or more than any other side. That is the biggest threat. They look not just in Yemen, but also they view in the region overall. And the second thing of the UAE, if we go back to our initial conversation about contractors and people up and lower in the chain, for them, Yemen is also a huge security contracting opportunity for the United States of America, especially on counterterrorism. What are they doing in Hadramaut? Hundreds of kilometers far from the first or the closest front line of the Houthis, nothing. But there is a space there, or a Mukalla Rayyan airport. It's being used for military counterterrorism operations in coordination with the United States of America. They have conducted various raids in Yemen, various attacks in different governorates in Yemen. And I think that's also another important buy-in for the UAE in Yemen, is to remain a very close friend of Trump or whoever in the White House by being an implementer of counter-terrorism operations in Yemen. And this is something very important for the United States of America, especially as the state fragmented and especially as the Americans had no more presence in the ground. So they depended much more on UAE in matter of operation and in matter of intelligence also.
Mm-hmm. Right. We have a question from Raquel Pereira. She wants to know how can we help in informing about the situation of Yemen or in Yemen, and how to denounce the violation of human rights that the civilians are enduring, and especially women.
I mean, both huge questions. I wish I have for that myself, but I think it is, the idea is how to get the Yemen spirit. This is one of the things we try to do, small things, what Natalia was doing in Yemen is one of them, like help more the press to go into Yemen, push more, support more media to be able, break the siege on Yemen around that. That's an important move, because I'm sure hundreds of thousands of people didn't know about Yemen before Natalia's article in the Spanish world. And that's an important, just to get the message across that continues to happen, I think is very important. We have always pushed and continue to do for international investigation for human rights, because that's very important, to be an independent entity that will hold all sides together accountable. All of the national frameworks, unfortunately, whether the ones by the Yemeni government or the ones run by the Houthis, are obviously one-sided, used, and definitely not independent, neither independent nor truthful to the victims and to the suffering of the Yemeni people. Definitely supporting an international frameworks and mechanism to hold this accountable is important. Definitely making sure there is more somehow ability of information to flow from Yemen is another use, because this is a serious issue. Yemen, as everyone was saying, was locked down even before COVID-19. You at one point had 3 planes for 27 million Yemenis. The movement in and out of the country is extremely limited, let alone for foreigner journalists, and that remains to be a huge challenge. Unfortunately, we don't send refugees to the West. That's why you don't care. Yemen is different from Syria in that context. So it has somehow helped everyone to keep a close eye, because there isn't much refugees coming from Yemen to Western capitals.
Thank you. There is a question from Joe Anthony, who says, thanks for a very interesting discussion. My question is on the peace process. What do you think is the way forward for 2021? And what is the role of the UN Security Council?
The UN Security Council has a mandate to update the Sanctions Committee and to update 2216 resolution in February. I think that's an important chance for it to take a new decision on Yemen, adopt a new resolution on Yemen, and obviously support the peace process that the UN envoy is leading so far on Yemen. There is a need to rethink the reward and punishment model that they have used in Yemen. It clearly haven't really functioned the whole time, and there needs to be a new list of sanctions, new criteria to punish those who stand in the way of peace. There must be a support for the UN envoy on Yemen, and there must be an international collective interest on having a peace in Yemen. That still haven't really been. The level of diplomacy being invested on Yemen is still extremely limited compared to other conflicts, compared to other crises, and compared to even other non-war conversations happening, whether within the West or within UN Security Council, or even in the region overall. That's something we cannot afford having much more longer, I think. And there is few good moments someone needs to think. I mean, it's not just because the bar is low, but because they are important moments we need to capitalize in. There is, someone who's less crazy in the White House. There is more or less Democrats now have a control over the Senate. This is new for Americans in the past 5 decades, and America's role in Yemen war is huge. And there is a new moment in the Gulf where, again, these rich countries are willing to continue somehow, it seems, to figure out their differences in Yemen. All of these milestones, I think, should be used to capitalize on that, to support Yemen, a peace process, not just in Yemen, but in the region overall. Hence, Yemen, however, is because of the situation, how bad it has gone, and because I continue to believe the conflict there is solvable, can be a priority for international attention on that, to pressure to use these moments and to actually try to architect something that supports the larger peace process.
We still have a few minutes, and we have a couple of questions, and they keep on coming. So this is a fantastic sign. David H tells us, a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much. What are the causes you would point out as reasons for relatively little Western involvement, unlike other conflicts in the region?
Repeat that, please.
What are the causes you would point out as the reasons for the relatively little Western involvement, unlike other conflicts in the region?
It's not relatively little. The West is a war holder in Yemen. You have the United States, United Kingdom supports the Saudis inside the P5 at UN Security Council. That's a huge, that's not a little. You have most of the Western countries selling weapons to Saudis and to UAE. You have a huge political coverage that's happening from your countries to almost everyone involved in Yemen war. So yes, the West is wearing a very good gloves in Yemen, but it's still a criminal there. It's still involved in how this war is being done, whether again via weapons or political support or in many other frameworks. I think the problem is we don't hear about it, but ultimately the bombs, that fall in Saada or in Sanaa or on funerals and weddings in Yemen are Western-made weapons. They are not Saudi-made weapons by the end of the day. So it is highly involved. It's also highly involved from an intelligence point of view, and it's highly involved again by even the political package of the Saudis and of the rest of the coalition. That is very different from being involved than from not looking involved. But even if you think of the relatively neutral Western countries in Europe, Spain, Holland, Sweden, all of these lovely countries still sell weapons to Saudis. So it is some sort of involvement, and it is some sort of, I think, criminality that they are partners in when it comes to Yemen war. There is no one who isn't really criminal.
We have a question from the Horacio Ducharne Foundation. They ask, who are the most important actors on the ground for Yemen to get peace done?
This is to get peace done, or who are the current biggest actors? This is two different questions. The current biggest actors in Yemen are, obviously, you have the Houthis, you have the STC in the south, you have the Hadi aligned fraction of forces around the country.
Can you explain what's the STC for our translators?
It is a big part. Southern Transitional Council, which is Yemen's version. They're trying to do what your friends tried to do in Catalonia. So to separate the south of Yemen alone to make it an entity by that. It's a politically...
The secessionist.
Yes, we would say self-determination, pro-self-determination group, but that's Southern Yemen. I don't know the audience. But that's a huge group involved also in Ghaithaa, as was showing in the map, in Adan, Lahj, Al-Dala, Abyan, these parts of the country. And obviously you have the Houthis, who control around 30% of the territory. But in that 30%, there is 70% of the Yemeni population. So they have a control over the most. And then you have a pro-Hadi government and semi-affiliations in the middle of the country. That's in the east, in Marib, obviously Shabwa, Hadramaut, Mahra, and some pieces here and there. These are the main three factors, in addition, obviously, to the Red Sea, where you have Tariq Saleh forces there involved in a big fighting. This is more or less the 4 to 5 camps of military power in Yemen. And you have freelancers here and there, but I think these are the biggest sides who have force and power in the ground at the moment.
So we have a question on oil, and this comes from Clara Rodriguez. Again, she wants to know if you think that Saudi Arabia can still go on with the project of building a pipeline, an oil pipeline through the region of Hadramaut to connect with Aden, like it was shown in a telegram during the WikiLeaks case.
I don't know, honestly. I have no idea.
Okay. And I'd say there is also one question on how to help economically, how to send help sort of like to projects, NGOs. Any suggestions?
I can ask for a list of recommended organizations maybe, and then we share it with you. But I honestly don't have much details on that. What I think is important in Yemen, there are few organizations doing good work that I can call, like ICRC, MSF, that are still able to absorb a donation, and they can use it in Yemen. That's usually not the case with local organizations, and even with big international organizations. But these are, for example, some of the two we have much less of an issue with, and I think that's that's gonna probably be more important in the next few years to figure out what one can do more, especially in supporting the country, because again, the tightening of the financial restrictions now with this new designation and all of the complications will only be much worse and will only be more difficult for NGOs and aid organizations to work around Yemen.
Mm-hmm. So before we go, and because you probably don't know, but we have currently two exhibitions in Casa Árabe about Yemen. One of them is about the idea of displacement and identity of the two female photographers. And the other one is a Spanish photographer that has done like a special photographic document on the island of Socotra. If you could, there is one last question. This is why I'm bringing our this short self-publicity, but it's basically because we have a question from Pilar Garcia about this island in the conflict. What is the situation of this island in the conflict currently?
First, I saw some of the photos of the exhibition. They're excellent, and the two Yemeni photographers I know very well are some of the best on the country. So thank you for actually hosting that. It's quite amazing. Socotra is, as you can see, is an example. It's thousands and thousands of miles far from the Houthis, but somehow UAE decided that it will help liberate Yemen from the Houthis by going into Socotra. So it went there years ago. Obviously, that has so far created almost another proxy war between its forces and the forces pro-Hadi, the Yemeni president there. And that obviously have created a lot of tensions the last few years. The island in many ways is under threat. It's one of the world's 7 wonders, and it was very peaceful and quite very far. Most haven't even been there in the past. It's isolated from the rest of the country. And right now it is in the face of, again, a huge war that already has existed in the island since 2017, and it's built up and built up. And yeah, that is a place that could easily have been saved from this entire turmoil. It's not all in the front line and by a bullet it came there. No, this is a very far place, but it's also an example of what I was trying to say earlier, how this proxy wars are so deep and so tightened and somehow have taken places that were always out of the usual Yemen conflict cycles.
Well, thank you very much. We have reached our allocated time. I think we've covered quite a lot. Definitely not enough for the complicated situation we'd like to explain, analyze, but I think it's a very good partnership that we've done today with the Center for Strategic Studies in Sanaa. Thanks a lot to you, Farea Al-Muslimi, director and co-founder of the center, to Ghaithaa Alrashidy, who was connected online from Sudan, from Khartoum, on her way back to Sanaa. Also, of course, thanks to Natalia Sancha, who was somehow the instigator of doing this roundtable, and also to unfortunately not to have her live, but we did manage to have a short but substantial participation from Natalia just before boarding her flight. This country, Yemen, I think is unfortunately as we started saying, not enough on the international media. We know of this amazing architecture, structures, all the archaeological wealth that Yemen has, or at least used to have. We have obviously seen the images of also destruction, of serious pulverization, as we can see now, of the country due to the ongoing war, especially since 2015, and of course the extremely concerning and alarming situation of Yemenis young generation, of the children, of malnutrition, and a serious stain, I think, on the conscience of the world, of the international institutions, that some of them do raise the alarms, but not enough is being done, and especially, as has been discussed, the flow of weapons going towards Yemen from many Western capitals has not stopped flowing during these years. So really concerning and alarming situation of the country. We have done our best to try to explain what's going on, to also to explain why we've reached this place so far. Thank you again, Farea, for joining us and for helping us understand much better this country. And we hope we can carry on. Thank you all of the participants, also for sending for asking questions, and some of them very interesting points that have been raised. So without further ado, I'll wait until we have this image out of. There you go. So we can have Farea finally. One last image from Farea before we go. Is he gone?
No.
There you
Thank
go.
you very much. Thank you, Karim, and to the team and everyone for organizing this. Looking forward more. Thank you again, and to everyone who showed up. Have a great night.
Excellent. Thank you also to our translators who made this happen, and to Eva, Susana, our translators, and our colleagues Gustavo and my colleague Ruth Pimentel for helping us behind the scenes. Until next time, please check, as always, our website, casaarabe.es, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.